We're here today at the Eureka Museum with Edmund Opp. Edmund, could you tell us a little bit about these items over here?
This here is a beer barrel, and that was used, they tell me, when Eureka was the wheat capital of the world, and the people had to bring it in, the wheat to Eureka with the oxen when there was no railroad stations beyond Eureka. And on the way home, they'd tie about 7, 8 wagons, would tie them together behind one team after the other. And the front wagon, they had the barrel of beer, and they started singing as soon as they left town, and were on their merry way home. Because some of them, they traveled 3 days to get the load of wheat to Eureka, because with the oxen, they'd have to drive up to 70 miles to get to a railroad station.
And what else do we have here?
This here is a still, and they were very scarce, but we had a neighbor, and one time I happened to see him brew some whiskey, and he put barley into this big tub here and heated it, and there's a coil going through a barrel, and that coil, that barrel was filled with cold water, and the other side there's a little pipe, that pipe coming out, and they had a glass setting under or a pitcher, and it just dripped out real slow. The steam going through from the hot to the cold water produced the alcohol. Whatever came out in that little pipe was alcohol, and it was quite powerful, I know.
Was making your own whiskey legal at the time?
No, that wasn't legal at the time, and that's why some of them probably brewed their own. But it wasn't, that was done secretly. That's why when of our neighbors there was only one, and that was so secretly that he wouldn't even show it to very many people.
And what else do we have behind you?
Behind me here's a clay oven that I read about them, and I thought it would be nice to have one, because we made our sod house or clay brick home. We had some leftover blocks, and I decided to make a stove, you know, but I didn't know how, because I had never seen one. And I ended up going to the nursing home, figuring, well, some of this, I knew this one old guy was close to 100 years old, and his mind was good. But even he said he saw them, he said, but he doesn't know how they made them. And then one time at the Centennial in Ashley, North Dakota, they had a clay oven there on a wagon. That was a traveling one. I don't know where it came from. And that was built, so I've tried to follow that, and I took the clay blocks and tried to make a stove. And I put it inside the building, because outside, you know, it'll take a lot of upkeep. And I built it right in here, and it's been holding up real good. It's about 15 years since I built that, and now it needs repair, so sometime I'll have to get at it and probably the cracks and redo it. Not redo the whole thing, but seal up the cracks.
Do you know how they were used?
Yes, they tell me they baked the nicest bread. There was no other oven that could bake bread like those clay ovens could. And I asked them, I know one of the old-timers told me that. And I asked him, well, what made it so good? And he said he doesn't know either, but they'd heat those blocks up until they were starting to get red hot. And I guess then they had a stand where they could shove the bread in, and they could break bread. They wouldn't need the fire no more, but just the heat from the blocks break bread all day.
What types of things would they use to heat the oven?
To heat it, I believe they used wood. From what I was told, they'd use wood. Here's an old wooden water pump. Even in those early days, even the cylinder was wooden, and they always had to have a little water to prime it. That's the only way it would pump. That's why this chuck is hanging here. And they'd prime it, and then it would pump, a wooden water pump. We never owned one in my family, but they were all regular pumps and brass cylinders, you know, the pumps that we have on the farm. But this is one of the early ones. And there's also a lady side saddle, which is very rare. They're hard to find. It's just one stirrup, and the ladies would sit sideways.
Did your mother have a side saddle?
Pardon?
Did your mother have a side saddle?
No. We got that from somebody from the area, you know, from the Long Lake area, which is about 30 miles from here.
Were the saddles used for work, or were they used for travel?
The side saddle?
Yeah.
I really don't know. I've never seen a side saddle before. This is the first side saddle I really saw, except on pictures. So in here, the fellow that brought it in didn't know anything about it. It was his grandfather's, my grandmother's use. He said his grandmother used them, so. This is one of the first gas pumps that I remember. I know when the first time I remember getting to town and filling gas, that goes by numbers, and you could sell up to 10 gallons of gas in one pump. They'd pump until it was full, and then they could, and if you needed more than 10 gallons, they'd pump again. And I can remember when gas was as low as 18 cents a gallon.
Did you have a gas tank at all on your farm?
Well, we had a gas barrel that I remember after 50. With a 50-gallon barrel was the first barrel I remember, and that we have it in the garage where we had to store the car, and we filled our own with a 5-gallon can to let it out of a spout and poured it in.
Do you remember your family's first car?
The first car I remember was a Model T Ford, and I believe it was about a 1923. I'm not sure on the year, but then we had the car until 1927, and then that was just a Model T with a top on it. It wasn't any glass windows or anything in the side, just a cover and then a windshield. But then in 27 we bought a Chevy that had glass windows and doors, you know, 4-door. And 27 Chevy is the second car.
Were you affected by rationing during World War II, such as gas rationing?
Well, during World War II, yes. During World War II, you got coupons, and one little square, you got a book, and one little square was for 4 gallons of gas a week. And once your book was empty, that was gone. And you were able to spread it out, so you couldn't go do any visiting really any distance. But the good thing about it, at that time we had a railroad here, and if you had to go any place, you could go by train. And that was real reasonable. You could go for a few dollars, you could go quite a ways with the train. But with the car, you could not go during the war. But the price didn't go up either during the World War II. Everything was froze, And that's probably what they should have done before they started another war.
What else was affected by rationing?
Oh, there was quite a bit of food that was affected. Like meat was awfully short, but like we lived on a farm, we had our own meat, so that wasn't a problem. But bananas were very scarce. Very seldom you'd get bananas. Even the stores just didn't have them. And I think most all fruit was a kind of a shortage. Syrup, you couldn't buy syrup. You couldn't get sugar. The sugar was rationed. I don't know if the syrup was rationed, but you could only get it when they had it. And it was awfully short, so. But the price couldn't go up because everything was froze. President Roosevelt froze everything, and we got by okay. But there's a lot of things, I suppose, if just wasn't available, or they didn't need more, and well, they couldn't sell it, and if they didn't have it.
Where would you get your rationing coupons from?
Where we got them? There was a kind of I believe there was a board. I know, like the fellas that were on the draft board, it seems to me they handed them out. Because there was 3 fellas in Eureka, in this area from the county, that during World War II, the guys had to register when they were 18 years old, and then they picked them whenever they needed them. And if anybody, I happened to be the only boy left, and my dad was an invalid, and we were farming. So my brother went to the service. My brother was a couple of years older than I was, and he was in the service for 5 years during World War II. And I got a farm deferment because I was the only one left, and they didn't take the last one on the farm if the father wasn't able to farm, because they felt they needed the food, and the food is what beat Germany. They had enough guns and tanks to fight for a long time, but they didn't have enough food. And once the soldiers got hungry, they gave up. They were able to, a lot of them, it would have cost the American people a lot of more people, losses if they'd had food. Because the guys were just willing, they knew they were so hungry, they knew that if they'd give up, they'd get food. And they said they had to kill some of them, a lot of them too, but some of the servicemen, but they tell them that they just didn't have food, and you can't keep on fighting if you don't have food.
What are we going to next?
Pardon?
Where are we going to next?
Probably, these are all grain cleaners. And these swing sieves here, I don't remember them, but the fellows bring them in, they said that they cleaned wheat with them. I don't remember a wheat cleaner like that. I can remember this one here, cranking it. But those must have been the earlier ones, because I never saw one until the people started bringing them in here.
What was the purpose of cleaning the wheat?
The purpose? Well, when it was thrashed, there was always buckwheat in, or there was wild oats in, or there was pitching grass in, and it seemed like that cleaner, the pitching grass would fall through the bottom, through that one sieve, and the wild oats would go out the back. And as you'd shake, that would get it reasonable clean, because you didn't want to seed that stuff, because there was enough weeds without seeding it yet. So you always cleaned the wheat that you seeded. we didn't clean the wheat we sold, because when you brought it in here in the elevators, they cleaned it usually. And because that would have been a big job with a hand mill to clean the wheat that you sell. But for seed, which you didn't need that much, but maybe 100 bushels or so, depending on how many acres you seeded.
What are we looking at here, Edmund?
You can probably see the walking plows here. And one of them has a breaker bottom on, like the breaker bottom. What I mean by breaker bottom is for breaking sod. And that's what the real pioneers used when they started breaking the sod with their oxen and horses. And they used a one bottom walking plow that they walked behind.
Would they use horses or oxen with that type of plow?
They used both. I mean, some of them that could afford to buy horses, they used horses, and a lot of people had to buy oxen because they were so much cheaper than the horses. The horses were the better thing, but oxen, they could break, for breaking, if they had enough oxen, 4 oxen, they could break a lot of sod too, but they were not good for hauling wheat to town. They'd only walk. Horses would trot, you know. You could travel with your wheat much faster with the horses than you could with the oxen. But for plowing, there wasn't much difference. The horses would walk too.
What other type of plows do you have?
You mean the brand?
Just various types.
Oh, like from the walking plow, they went to the one, if you can see the red, that's a sulca. That's a riding plow already. And that was just one bottom. And then they came out with a 2-bottom plow where you could sit on there and have handles to control it, which was much easier because it was awfully hard, from what they tell me, to hang on to those handles all day long, you know, and sod especially, breaking sod. You really had to have a firm grip in order to keep that plow down on the ground. But the walking plow, they put the handles down, that made the pressure was there, and they could ride it and sit on there and didn't have to walk. Yeah, I thought the hardest thing was walking, but the fellows told me that the walking wasn't the hardest part. It was your hands trying to keep that plow down and sod. And then, well, once we got tractors, this is one of the earliest tractor plows. It's a 3-bottom plow, John Deere plow, and it went with a D John Deere. That was, I know my father bought a D John Deere and a 3-bottom plow like that, exactly like this one here. And that's the first tractor plow that I remember on our farm.
Did you use this plow yourself? This type of plow?
If I used it?
Did you use this type of plow?
Yes, even when I started farming, I bought that tractor and the plow from my dad. And I used that for a number of years, and close to probably about 8 years. And then, the tractors came out with hydraulics and mounted and everything. And everything got better. I think, here's something that's unusual. This is called a Smut Machine. And the seed wheat, you always had to treat. What I mean by treating, they put formaldehyde in here, and the wheat they put on one side, and the formaldehyde and water, mixed the water with formaldehyde. And there was a little pipe feeding that. And this, the weight of the wheat would drive this and mix the wheat. And they always had to treat the seed wheat. If they didn't, it got smut. And even if you didn't want to, you couldn't keep it over because you couldn't sell what you didn't seed. So sometimes if you run out and probably had a round or two left, you thought, oh, you can seed that. But there were a lot of black heads in that were empty. And finally, probably after around World War II, they came out with smut-resistant wheat, and we could just quit treating the wheat for smut. But this was at the time when they came to this area, they had to treat the wheat. I don't know, the pioneers didn't have it, but when I grew up, that was a common thing. Every farmer had something to treat the wheat with for smut resistant.
Where did you get the formaldehyde?
We bought that, I believe, in the drugstore. And it didn't take much. One bottle, you know, it's probably a quart bottle, and it took just a little measuring cup with 10 gallons of water. And you could probably mix, about 25 gallons of wheat with that.
All right, Edmund, what are we looking at here?
This is what we call a corn binder. And that's a one-row corn binder that ties the corn, cuts the stalks, the ears, and everything, and then it makes a bundle. And in the early days, before the silage cutters, they used that to feed the cattle. In the wintertime, it was good feed for the cattle and horses, bindered corn. That was before the silage cutter. And then we're looking at cultivators, one-row cultivators.
What used to pull both of these machines? What pulled both of these machines?
These can be used for potatoes or corn, and it's one-row cultivator. And they pulled it with 2 horses. They didn't have the big cornfields they have like now, because with one-row cultivator you couldn't cultivate too much corn. So the man could sit on there and you had to guide it with your feet so that wouldn't pull out the corn, you know. If the horses didn't walk completely straight, you know, with your feet, you could guide it, and it would shift real easy with your feet.
And what do we have here?
This is a 1917 Model T, and that was completely restored about 30 years ago. And it's been in the museum all of just about that long.
Do you have any interesting stories involving you in a Model T?
Well, I was about 10 years old, and the bigger boys went to the baseball game, and for some reason they only wanted to use one car. So I had to stay back, and in the meantime, while I was home alone, and 3 of the neighbor boys came, and they were all about my age, about 10 or 11 years old. And there was a Model T that was at our place, sitting there where the boys got together and went to the baseball game. And we 4 boys, we couldn't crank the thing to get it started. So we pushed it until we got to a little hill. When it went downhill, we could push it and got it started. And we all drove that car that day. And one of them, I think he was the oldest one, and he had never driven either. and he was going to show us that we went slow, as slow as we could, and he was going to show us how to go, and we got too close to the barn, and he lost control and hit the barn. Boom! That was a dead stop. And those fenders, you know, the wheels took most of the bump, but somehow the car must have chumped a little because the fenders were bent. And we tried to straighten them out, but that was a lost cause.
Did you get into any trouble?
No, I don't know. I don't know how we got by. I don't remember. I don't recall whether we got into trouble with it, because after that I usually got to go along to a baseball game. They probably didn't trust me.
Did you ever take any family trips in the Model T?
Yes, I remember going to my uncle's place, West River, and we went straight west to the Missouri River, and there was no bridge at that time. And we drove all at once. There was a place where there was a boat, a pretty big boat, and we were driving with the Model T, and there were about one pickup truck and 3 cars. I don't remember if they were all Model Ts, but they were all older cars. And we got all on that one boat, and with a pedal boat, and that took us across the river. And then when we stayed at my uncle's place, probably a day or two, we came back, the same way we crossed the river. That was the first boat ride I had.
And what type of farm equipment is this?
This is what we call a reaper. And the reaper is the first cutting machine that came out. Before that, in all countries, from the books we have, they cut the wheat and grain and even their hay with a scythe. And when Eureka got started in 1887, the pioneers came here in 84, but they were here 3 years before we had the railroad. And then after that, they were able to buy machinery. And my dad told me that they always cut the grain, for those 3 years with the scythe. And so the whole family went out there, and they had to cut and rake it, pile it up into bundles and tied it and took care of the grain. But then when they were able to buy a reaper from an implement dealer in Eureka, 4 farmers got together and bought a reaper, which is 4.5 foot cut, and they pulled it with 2 oxen. And then harvesting, he said, went so fast, because they had small fields, and cutting with a 4 foot is a big improvement from a scythe. You're standing right there with the scythe. If you want to bring it over, you can. We'll take a look at what the scythe really is. This is what the scythe is called. That's what they call the scythe. In order to cut the grain, they had to go way down, get a good swing, go all the way, and that's pretty hard to do. I know, like, when I was on the farm, and even after I was growing up, my dad could swing this, and cut everything at one sweep, and some would always be standing. And he always told me, you aren't holding it right. But he never told me which way I should hold it. Finally, after watching him, he kept this straight all the way, and then it cut it. But if I, just swing, I swung hard, and tried to cut it all, and it just wouldn't cut it all. So there's a trick to everything, even cutting grain with a scythe.
Would neighbors come and help cut with scythes, or did just your family cut with scythes?
I didn't understand you.
Would neighbors help harvest with scythes? Would the neighbors come help you?
They usually had a hired man to help cut, unless they had a lot of boys. Because if you had, you know, I don't know how many acres they had, but if they sometimes have read where they'd plow or break up with 4 horses or 4 oxen, they could break up to 40 acres of sod in a year. And you had a 40-acre field. That took a lot of help to get that cut with a scythe. And then they used a wooden rake. I don't remember what. Yeah, that's it. Bring that wooden rake over. That's a big old rake, and with that rake, my dad told me they would rake it onto piles so they could tie it. Make a big enough pile so it'd make one bundle. And that was before the days of a binder.
After they made the piles, then what would they do with it?
Well, they must have just raked it until they had enough for a pile, a bundle of rake. He said it was about like a binder, a bundle. They made them small enough so you could pick them up and carry them. But the reaper took care of that because the reaper bunched it already. So then all they had to do, they didn't have to rake it. That made bunches, and then they just walked along and tied it. I never saw a wooden rake before until we got this one in. It's funny, like in the museum, how much of that old stuff is around. And I never knew a lot of that stuff. But I can see that it would do a good job. It's white, and I would rake the grain together.
All right. What does this piece of machinery here do?
This here that is called a sweep rake, and they pulled that with 1 horse on each side. So it took 2 horses to pull this sweep rake, and they'd go right over the raked windrows of hay and make pretty big piles of hay. And to begin with, they probably just started pushing it on piles and made little stacks. But finally they got what we called an overshot stacker that would go up and lift the hay up to make a higher stack or a big stack. And they used them that way until the tractor sweep rakes came out.
And which piece of farming implement is this?
This here is what we call a hay rake. And that rakes the hay. And when the rake gets full, that was pulled with 2 horses. And there's a little handle there that you stepped on, and it lifted the rake, and it dumped the rake into windrows.
And what about that piece of machinery behind you?
That hay loader there, they hooked out a hay loader behind the wagon box like that, the way it's pictured there. And there's a little pickup that picked up the hay, and those arms pushed the hay up into the hay wagon. And if there was 2 men up in the hay box to put the hay together, they could fill a wagon load of hay within 2 minutes. And if there's only 1 man up there handling, he couldn't get it away fast enough. They had to stop the horses all the time. So it took longer, but if there was 2 men up there, they'd fill a load of hay in a hurry. And they hauled it home into big old wheat stacks, long wheat stacks, and kept the hay for the winter.
Once this wagon was filled, what would they do with the hay?
If what?
Once the wagon was filled, where would they take the hay?
They'd haul it home to the farmyard or put it up in the hay loft. You know, a lot of those barns with hip roofs, you know, those barns would hold a lot of hay, and a lot of them was hauled home into the barn right away, or haystacks out in the open.
Did you ever use one of those types of equipment?
Oh yes, but I never worked on it. I was too young. But my older brothers, my dad had a hay loader like that. And so I saw that. We used it for a few years that I can remember. And until better equipment, when the tractors came out, and then there was better equipment than the hay loaders.
Did the younger kids drive the wagon?
Yeah, so there was one smaller boy. I got to drive the wagon when they filled out. I drive the horses. I was big enough to drive the horses, but not big enough to push the hay ahead. These here are markers. When they divided Dakota Territory into North Dakota and South Dakota, for some reason the federal government provided money, put these markers in there, and it took 720 markers across the state, starting from Minnesota to Montana, and it took 16 men 2 years to. First of all, they shipped them in by rail or by boat, along the river by boat, but it took 16 men 2 years to haul them out with the wagons. They had to manhandle them, and they're on the ground about 3 feet and weigh about 700 pounds. So there was a lot of hard work there. The man that got the contract, he advertised for the strongest, 16 strong. He'll hire the 16 strongest men in Dakota Territory, and he got 16 men together. But anyway, they had to manhandle and dig them into the ground, and they weigh 700 pounds. And on one side it'll say South Dakota, and the other side North Dakota, and then the mile marker. And it's 720 so markers for all across, so it takes 2 miles, so it would be 360 miles from Minnesota to Montana. And no other states are marked that way. And why the federal government did that, they really don't know for sure. They think it had partly something to do with the Indians. When they started in Minnesota to go across, and they started working, and whatever they did in one day, and then by the next morning, everything was gone. They didn't want those markers on their land, you know. And then the federal government got involved, and that's how they probably paid for it. And also brought the soldiers along and went through the federal government, and then they told them that if anything disappears now, the soldiers will take care of the problem. And after that, they left and said, they explained them that it isn't going to harm them, that they're there, you know, they'll be all over the state, and they aren't going to destroy any of their property or anything, but they're going to be there. And so that's probably why those are the only states that were marked that way. And now when they make a road, the center of the road divides the states. So the contractors, when they make a road, that isn't even considered. And most of them, they bury them, go over with the caterpillar, and they're gone. Sometimes they'll set one over. But wherever there's prairie road, they're still setting. And one time, there was a team of horses that were a runaway, and they hit it with the horse. One horse hit that rock, or maybe both of them. But anyway, one horse was dead, and the rock was broken. So they're in the ground deep, and they're solid.
Did you have any of these on your land?
No, they're along the state line, and we were about 6 miles from the state line. But anybody that lived next to the state line, they had them on their land. This one came from 3 miles west of Eureka. And that was picked up. Somebody must have dug it out and loaded it on a pickup. And when they went over the railroad tracks, they lost it. And the next day, evidently they didn't know it. They probably went all the way home and didn't look. And the next day, the farmer saw it was when he went got onto it and didn't know what to do, so he called the sheriff. And then the sheriff said that he knows that the Eureka Museum has been trying to get a marker. and the county couldn't give them, and they even applied to the state, and the state couldn't give them because the federal government provided the money. But they said if we find one buried, we can have it, or if they make a road, we can pick it up before they bury it. But that never happened. And then this one we got through that legally. The sheriff said they should bring it in here because they'll only come back at night and pick it up, whoever took it out. And then we have one sitting over there, which is a half-mile marker, same thing except that it's half a mile. And that one was hit with a plow. A plow brought it up on the edge of the field. And well, that we had permission from the state. If we find a buried one, that was a buried one. But we can't get that as red as this. That was buried a long time, and we just washed and scrubbed and tried everything. But it just wouldn't get shiny like the ones that are out in the open. In 1887, when they built the railroad tracks from Roscoe to Eureka, which is about 35 miles, they used 100 of these stump wagons and pulled them with 3 mules. They claimed the mules got up on that loose ground better than the horses could. And that little handle there controls the dirt. When that was filled, they could haul it away, and they released that handle, and then it dumped the dirt wherever they wanted to. And the railroad tried to keep the tracks as even as possible, so the low places needed a lot of dirt sometimes to fill it up so the tracks could be quite even.
Where did the railroad find workers to build the track?
Oh, they brought their own workers. A lot of those German people, you know, would have liked to work, you know, when you settled here and were new and had probably free time some months of the year. But railroad brought their own workers. So very few got a job for the railroad, because when they started something, they had the workers, and unless somebody quit, that was the only way a new guy could get in.
And what type of farm implement is this?
This is one of the earlier manure spreaders, and it's built out of wood. And when they'd clean the barns in the wintertime, they'd always haul the manure out in the fields. And this is a Moline spreader, and one dealer told me that that's one machine that the dealers wouldn't stand behind of. What he meant, they wouldn't stand behind when they're spreading manure.
And why would they spread manure?
Well, there's a handle to that drives those spreaders, those gears there will go around and spread the manure, and these chains keep moving it back as it's needed. And the horses have to move in order to, unless it would otherwise give one pound. They kept going. They'd just walk and pull it. And it could be pretty deep snow, and they'd still spread the manure with the horses.
Why would the farmers want to spread manure?
Well, that was their way of fertilizing.
Was this ever used to spread out manure to dry?
To dry? No. No. You mean for it to burn? Mm-hmm. No. We have patches in the sod house where I can explain you how they dried that manure and how they spaded it out, but now we haven't got that here.
And what is this right here?
This is the first fire truck Eureka had. In the early days, they just had carts that they had to pull to the fire and hand pumped for pressure. But in 1936, they bought a truck, and the price of it was supposed to have been $1,200 with the water tank. Now the water tank is off because they had to take it off before it came out to the museum. But in 36, since there was no way of people had money for buying anything, they bought it for $526.95, a little bit less than half what it was supposed to bring. But the dealer just wanted to get rid of it, and so we had a fire truck. And they used that about 50 years, went to the fire and back to the shop, and it now has 1,700 miles, 1,711 miles on the speedometer. Never left the town of Eureka. After they got another truck, and that had a bigger tank on and was a better truck, so they always took that truck, the bigger one, to go to the neighboring towns. And like now they're going to have 4 trucks, and they go even out to the farmyards if there's a prairie fire or something. But that never left the town of Eureka. It's almost a new truck as far as miles are concerned, 1,700 miles. But the motor is pretty well wore. That pumped a lot of water. For some reason, they had a lot of fires in the early years. Why, I don't know, but a lot of it was probably elevators, and there was no way of controlling dust. Now, I mean, like roller mills, almost every roller mill in the area I read was burned down, and they had no way of collecting the dust, and that accumulated. And then if anything got hot, a bearing or something, well, it doesn't take much to start a fire. Most roller mills in this area were burned down. I think every town almost had a roller mill.
Was the fire department volunteer, or were they paid to be firemen?
Is what?
Were the firemen volunteers?
What
Were the firemen volunteer firefighters, or were they paid?
I think they were volunteers mostly at that time.
And if that fire truck didn't go out to farms, how did you put out fires on farms?
Oh, before they had fire trucks out in the farm, they had to help themselves. Once they were established as pioneers, they plowed a fire break, and before the grass got dry, they plow fire breaks clear around their farm from every direction in a circle and protect their hay and their buildings. And if a fire came out, but the only way they could stop it was sometimes they'd start what they called born ahead, born against the fire. And that way they could sometimes control it, unless the wind shifted and they got fooled sometimes. But fire was a big problem for the pioneers. When those grass got going, and all prairie mostly, there was no way of stopping that. Some of it went probably 50 miles until it finally got stopped. Went with the wind, you know. And the wind didn't turn, well, it just went one direction.
Have you ever had to put out a prairie fire when you were younger?
Oh yes, I helped fight one. And that happened to be, we built, my brother, when he started farming, older brother, started farming, and then the very first year they put the buildings up. They had just a house and a barn there, and they moved them there. And then a prairie fire came, and right towards the farm. And I was plowing with the John Deere tractor and a 3-bottom plow. And all at once, you know, that when I saw that smoke coming, I headed, you know, that tractor would only go about 4 miles an hour. I headed that way, you know, and we started, and then one of the neighbors came yet with a plow and a tractor. And we started plowing. We got one line around the buildings, and then my dad was still around, and he knew that you have to burn ahead if there's a little jump, you know. We just had enough time to make one round with a 3-bottom plow and a 2-bottom plow. The neighbor had the 2-bottom plow. And made one round, and he said, that'll jump. And they lit it and burned against it, and they stopped the fire that way. So those old-timers, they experienced all kinds of things. I'd have never thought of burning against it. But, you know, as long as the fire is small, it'll burn and will not jump. But once that comes in with the wind, that'll jump even a road.
And what type of tractor do we have here?
This is what we call a D John Deere, a 1929 model. And that tractor, we have a picture here, when it was new, it had steel wheels. And sometime while the farming progressed, why they cut the wheels, spokes off of the wheels and welded rims on and put rubber tires on. So now this tractor has rubber tires. So originally it had steel wheels. And that's one of, at that time, that was called the daddy of the John Deere tractors. That was the biggest ones John Deere's made. It pulled a 3-bottom plow. And I remember when my dad bought a plow, and I thought it was 1930, but I think it was 1929. But I remembered when he bought the plow and the tractor, and he bought them together for $1,200. And then all in our area, there were a few smaller tractors, like a Fordson tractor that pulled a 2-bottom, but we had a tractor that had pulled a 3-bottom plow, and that was big business then.
Did your tractor have metal wheels or rubber wheels?
The rubber was much better after. We did the same thing with our tractor. Later on, we put rubber tires on, and the tractor would have pulled 4 bottoms as easy on rubber tires as it did on steel, 3-bottom on steel. 3-bottom for steel, but on rubber it would have been a 4-bottom tractor. But we had weights on it, and without the weights it probably wouldn't do it.
And what is this piece of machinery right here?
This is a little garden tiller. And Raker had an experiment farm here, and they were one of the first ones that ever bought a garden tiller, and that still has steel wheels, and they raised different vegetables they were trying to experience, so they needed something to handle instead of digging with a fork, you know, to spade the garden. And they tell me that worked real well. That dug up the soil real good. There's little hooks on there that digs up the ground. And it's a gas tractor, and it's got to be the early 1900s. And there's no name on there. I don't know what kind of a make it is.
Did your family have a tiller at your farm?
No, we plowed with a hand plow. The garden, that's the only thing we plowed with the hand plow that I know ever saw plowing. It was the garden, because with the hand plow you can go in and get right up to the fence and everything in the corners, and with a bigger plow you couldn't do it.
What types of food did you grow in your garden?
What's that?
What types of food did you grow in your garden?
In our garden? Well, in the garden we plowed all kinds of vegetables, cabbage, corn, and a few potatoes. The big field of potatoes we usually had out in the field, but we had some in the garden, so for the summer to dig out a few and as they grew. But we planted everything: carrots, beets, little sweet corn, and radishes and lettuce, and trying to think what else do we plant in the garden. Maybe I covered most of it, but I probably missed some. Well, they'd even planted cucumbers or watermelons, something like that too, pumpkins.
Did your mom ever can any of the vegetables?
Oh yes, they canned some of it. Yeah, they canned the beets and stuff like that. Anything that didn't keep, you know, like potatoes kept over the winter. But anything that didn't keep, that canned.
What is this tractor here?
This is a 1924 Fordson tractor. And it was one of the earlier tractors that Henry Ford made after he made the Model T. And he also first started a tractor that could only be run on wheels. And finally he developed one that you could drive and even start working in the fields. So this one, I read that When he first started producing them, they sold them for $400. It was a small tractor, a pulled about 2-bottom plow. It was on steel, and there were quite a few of them around because the $400 is easier to buy than like that John Deere we were talking about. That was almost twice as much money, but it was, John Deere came out with a better tractor than Fordson did, one that stood up better. For some reason, it always got better. A few years later, they produced better equipment. Because Fordson, though, was still first on the line.
And what type of buggy do we have here?
This is what they call a courting buggy. It's just one seat for 2 people. And it's a Sears Roebuck, was ordered by the Sears Roebuck and Company when it was new. And it sold for about $36 at the time. And it pulls easy. 1 horse can pull that easy, but it's just for traveling. And it rides nice because those springs will take all the bumps. So it's for traveling, it rode real nice. And it still does. If we take it out, that still rides nice. But it's just for traveling. Anytime they wanted to haul a load of wheat, they had to have a wagon or a sled, bobsled. They could haul wheat and coal or whatever they wanted to haul, but not with a buggy.
Did you ever take any trips in a buggy?
Oh yes, we drove to school with a buggy. We drove to church with a country church and the country school with a buggy, and then in the wintertime we drove with a bobsled.
How far away did you have to go to school?
We had about 2 miles.
What type of school did you go to?
You mean?
Was it a one-room schoolhouse? Did you go to a one-room schoolhouse?
A one-room schoolhouse, yes.
How many kids were in your class?
The first year I went, I think we had about 25. And then by the time I got to the 7th grade, we only had 3 students left. And then when I went to the 8th grade, our school was closed, and I went to the neighboring country school. So they even started disappearing. Of course, that happened. A lot of the farms disappeared in the 30s.
Were most of the students who went to school, were their parents German, and were they German?
In our area, they were all German people, and they were all in the same boat. First graders had problems, for a while, but they soon caught on and were able to catch the English language.
You mentioned this was a courting buggy. Did you ever use it to court anyone?
No. By that time, we had a car.
What types of things did you do on dates?
On a buggy?
Just on your dates. Where did you go for dates?
For dates? Well, we went to the show. Like, my wife lived in North Dakota, which is we were only 6 miles from North Dakota, but she lived about 15 miles away, northeast from our farm. And we'd go to Ashley. That was the closest town then to a show hall on a Sunday night. And we went to barn dances. But shortly after, like around World War II, barn dances quit for some reason. Well, most of the young guys were gone, and that just afterwards, there were dances, but they were usually in a town. The barn dances weren't. And I think the fire department got pretty tough with the guys that had barn dances because they had knocked their whole farm out didn't want to insure them. And so they had to quit the insurance companies. And I can't blame them, because if a fire would have started, well, that would have been bad on a barn.
Okay. And what do we have over here?
That's a jail that came from the neighboring town of Roscoe. And that has 2 cells and 2 steel beds on each room. So they could hold 4 prisoners. And they claim nobody ever broke out of this jail. This is hardened steel. This is, you can take a hacksaw and saw on it, and it just won't even start. You just can't saw it. And like a lot of the jails, I remember Eureka had a jail made out of cement, and then they had bars, steel bars over the windows. But they would sometimes saw off the bars and get out. But they claim in this jail, nobody got out. And they just had a small opening to get food in there. And when I was young, I was always told that if you get to jail, all you get is bread and water. And I can't prove that whether I was fooled or whether there were facts. But I've talked to older people about that, and they said they're sure that that's all they got. So I don't know.
Did you ever hear any stories when you were younger about people going to jail?
Yeah, well, it was mostly if a guy got drunk, and then the cop would throw him in overnight. But otherwise, I know when I was younger and we got to go to town once in a while, the first thing we'd go to the jail to see if somebody is in there. And one time I think the guy was kind of sitting low and we didn't see him. We were looking in the window and he came up and we ran. We didn't come back to that place no more. And there's no way he could have gotten out, but he still scared us. But they were usually drunks, what I remember being in.
Where are you standing right now?
I'm standing in a little barn that we built inside the steel building here. And the reason we built it, because we want to preserve the hayloft, the rafter, the crib, and the stanchions. And then when we had that done, we thought it isn't a barn and it has a cow in there or a pig. The pig we built out of wood. We carved that out of wood. And the cow was it's a Baden animal. It was from the Equity Farm Store. They had the cow like that, and that's made out of hard paper. But this pig is solid wood here. And we built it right here.
How many cows did you keep in your barn?
Oh, we probably had up to 20 cows when more of my brothers were at home. They were bigger farmers.
Did you have any chores to do in the barn?
Oh, yes. Every day in the wintertime, you had to clean that barn daily and haul it away and feed the cattle and horses. At that time, the horses and cows were kept in the barn in the wintertime.
Did you ever have to milk any cows?
Milk? Oh, yes, I milk cows. I know when I was younger, I was the youngest of the boys, and we had a good pony to get the cows. In the morning, I liked to get up in the morning anyway, so they told me I had to take the pony and get the cows. And in the meantime, my mother would have breakfast ready and eaten, and by the time I'd get the cows and horses home, they were out in the pasture. It probably took me half hour to bring them home. And then I could go and eat, so I didn't have to milk until I got older. I got out of milking. I'd rather rode that horse anyway than milk cows.
Did you have any favorite chores that you preferred to do?
Favorite? Well, my favorite was working with horses while I was younger. I liked horses for some reason. My dad was a horse lover too. He raced good horses, and he even, like I mentioned one time, that he took them to the fair, and he did well with them.
Did you have any chore that you did not like to do?
Well, it was probably cleaning the chicken barn. For some reason, I always had to, the older brothers would clean the barn, like for the cattle, and we had one barn for cattle and one barn for horses. And they'd clean them, and I'd have to get the manure out of the chicken barns. And for some reason, I don't know why, but I hated that so much. And later on, I got allergies and I got tested. And I found out I was allergic to chickens. And that was probably part of the reason, because I know my nose would start running and runny eyes, but I had no idea that that was from the chickens or chicken manure or whatever it was. But I got stuck with them. The older boys would give the orders. And, well, they thought that I can't handle when we started out, I couldn't handle the manure from cows was heavy. And from chicken barn, that was mostly straw, and that I could handle. But they didn't know either that I was allergic to that stuff.
Were your chores different during the winter than they were during the summer?
Well, in the winter, there was more chores to do. But then in the summer, there was much more other work to do out in the fields and the prairie. And you had to make fences. You had to keep them up, you know, and work the fields and make the hay and bring in the crops, you know, thrashing and all that. So in the summer, there was more work. But in the wintertime, more chores just locally. Because in the summertime, all you did was you'd bring the cows in and milk them and let them out again, and you didn't have to clean the barn. But in the wintertime, you had that job of keeping the animals in the barn.
Why is that cow in a head catch back there?
Oh, and that's what we call a stanchion. And the cows, some barns had extensions like that, and they'd lock them in, and each one would fit, you know, side by side. They'd usually leave about 4 or 5 feet for one cow, and a stanchion like that would fit in there. Here we have a little horse or a little pony that we carved out of wood. And we've got this is what they call a weaning halter here with those spikes in there. Most people tied the colts up for about a month and that would wean them. But one fella brought this in, so it probably was used to. But everybody asks what that's for, so I think it wasn't used much. I had never seen it. And then here we have what they call a harness buck. When their harnesses would break, they'd lock that harness in to those jaws with that lever, and then they could sit on here and stitch their harnesses. Then the big horse, we built that, carved it out of wood too. That was quite a job because it's a big horse and takes a lot of carving to do. And it's got a nose basket on here to protect them from the flies. The flies there was some kind of flies that would go in the bottom of their nose, and they'd get so ornery and unmanageable. They'd always get tangled with each other, the harnesses or even the trays where they were hitched on, unless they had a nose basket and a fly net on their back. If you had that on them during the fly season, there was no problem. But without them, it was next to impossible to control them. If you had 4 or 6 horses hitched on anything during the fly season, they were always tangled without the fly net or a nose basket. And this would also be used during picking corn. If they didn't have it on, and then they would always go to a different row and try to pick an ear off. They were on them, and if they had this on, and then they'd stay in their rows better. Because there was no driver usually. You were picking corn, and the horses walked along as you told them to go and stop.
Did you ever have problems with runaway horses or horses getting tangled up?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I had runaway horses myself. I one time was raking hay, you know, and then when I turned around, the outside wheel got caught on a rock, and then they broke the hitch, and then the seat where you sit on fell down, and I was in the rake, and they started, and that part of the rake hit their hind feet, so they got scared and took off, and I was stuck in there for a while, and finally, after they got more speed, that rake, the stump that was broken, got stuck in the ground and lifted up, and I got out. I mean, it just ran over me, and I was out, and I wasn't hurt, but I was worried in there for a while. Then one time I had the rake was all shot by the time they stopped. The wheels were all bent because they run until they were tired out. And that kept hitting them, you know, and that was so bad. That's why they wouldn't stop until they were completely worn out. Because the rake would jump and hit them and kept hitting them.
Did you have different horses on your farm for plowing and then different horses for herding your cattle?
I started herding cattle when I was 6 years old. We had a little pony, and that was tame. If a child was on there or younger people, that horse would not run. And if a grown-up got on, it would run for him like mad. But the only way I herd cattle about a mile away from the farm when I was 6 years old. And the only way I get off and on, I could get off quite easy, but I couldn't get back on. I'd drive up, lead the pony up to a fence post, and I stood on the wires of the fence post, and then I could get on the horse again. But that pony was so tame, you could do whatever you want.
Did you have a favorite horse?
Yeah, I think that first horse, I remember its name, it was Smalley. And, you know, so when you grow up with something like that and you're able to ride him, and I rode that horse a lot. And that was still all around the most favorable horse I had ever saw or owned or was familiar with, because it took care of children. I mean, it just would not run for children. Evidently, it sensed that they couldn't hang on or something.
Where would you fix horseshoes on your farm?
If what?
Where would you fix horseshoes on your farm?
Horseshoes?
Did you shoe your horses?
No. Earlier they did. My dad used to talk about horseshoes, and we had old horseshoes that when they went to town sometimes, you know, especially when they drove cross country, and sometimes there was a lake in the way, and if they were shoed, they could drive over the lake, you know, if the ice was thick enough. Didn't have to go around it. So that's why they shoot horses.